Well, it's so good to be with you again. I invite you to turn with me as we continue our study of Ecclesiastes, and we started chapter 3 last week. And in that study, we began to look at time. We talked about a very, very famous passage within Ecclesiastes, really within the whole Bible. It is something that was made into music, best-selling songs. It's sometimes read at weddings, etc. But today we're going to continue our thought about time, but we're going to look at it from a perspective of God's time. So to segue into that, just as a reminder from last week, we read through that passage about everything has a season, and there's a time for every matter, and we have observed that today. It's with us in the change of seasons we're even going through now. It applies to us seasonally, and we look at the earth and we see it, but it also is part of our life, and we reflect upon it. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes it's a difficult way, because time can go so rapidly, and we see the cycle of life. And so there's all these contrasts provided, 28 separate mentionings of time. They're usually in a contrast, and we talked about those in various stanzas, and we looked at sections of that last time, but there's a reminder of this absolutely beautiful, wise, and poetic section. But while I did not review those individual elements, we see that this beautiful passage has endured, and it deals with a lot of the complexities, but also the universal nature of life. And that even with the advent of various technologies, there are things that continue in their course, and the things that are written here in Ecclesiastes are absolutely universal, and they are eternal. But there's another element here, and they speak to what's called the immutability of God, in that there are things that God has set, and we can't change it. As an example, as much as we may not want there to be the season of winter, it is already established. It is immutable. It is part of which God has made. We may say we don't want to age anymore. We don't want to get older. That is an immutable fact, that we will age, that time will catch up with us. We acknowledge what we can't change, but we can see the beauty in it, and we can see the awesome power of God in it. It's critical, because we've seen Solomon here falling into some despondency and vexation, that we not go in that path. We don't feel helpless, that we accept it, we celebrate it. We can be like the author of the great hymn and say, "How great thou art," and see God in every season and every time, and all of the cycle of life. But also, you will also see as you study those various times that there are opportunities that we do have to make decisions. And one of those decisions is how we accept and we trust God. It's our choice to say, "How great thou art," or it's our choice to shake our fist at him. It's our choice to be ungrateful, to enter into depression versus to live a life of joy. So let's accept the things that are immutable, but let's also make the right decisions and turn to God for every time and season of life. Now, here we're talking about an attribute of God, the immutability of God. We're also going to talk today about how times are in God's hands and God's view of time, as the title of today's message is God's Time. So, continuing on from that passage, which was really, if you read it in your Bible, it's probably set aside kind of as poetry there. It's now back to the narrative. What gain has the worker from his toil? So that was one of the things that was vexing Solomon. Remember, he went through the pleasures of life. He made a catalog. He was like a scientist. He was experimenting with things. And he held nothing back. And that didn't satisfy. And so another thing he looked at was the worker and his toil. But here, he's not vexed by it, But he says, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. That's acknowledging something. That one of the true gifts that God has given us, in that earlier part of Ecclesiastes 3, it said there's a time to be born. He's given us the privilege of birth and life. Each of us has been given talents, gifts bestowed upon us by God, and we've all been given time. He's given us time to be busy with, that we're stewards of the birth, of the life that we're given. We're stewards of the gifts and the talent we're given. And we're a steward of the precious time. When we look at that cycle of time, it is very fast fleeting. The seasons go by fast. Sometimes it seems not so much, but when we look back at it, and the older we get, boy, time goes by fast. We're a steward of that time. While we have it, it's limited. We should make the most of it. We should do the business that God has given us. A call, a time to make the most of our life. And I'm not going to have us turn to it, but I would remind you, if you're familiar with them, Jesus taught parables about being a faithful steward, about being a wise steward. We often apply it to our finances, and certainly it is applicable there. But our time is every bit as precious as the financial resources that we have. Can I encourage you to be busy with the business that God has given you to be busy with? What has He called you to do? What gift has He given you? Take the time that you've had and use it to be God's time. Well, here's another thing to reflect upon. That God has made everything beautiful in its time. We often only see things in a very limited context. That's part of who God is as well. He sees the end from the beginning. He sees it all. He knows the purpose of everything. We often don't. But God does have a plan. We should trust it. We should say that He will make all things beautiful. All things work together. God has a plan. I'm going to share with you a few examples, and you, I'm sure, could come up with your own. These are just anecdotal ideas. Let's think of a person that has a diagnosis of cancer. Probably one of the scariest things we could contemplate, isn't it? And I know some that are listening have gone through it in your life, and I bet almost every one of us have a friend, a family member, or someone we love that has been touched by this terrible disease. And certainly we wish it did not exist. First of all, why is there even cancer in the world? Because we're in a fallen world, because there's sin in the world. And therefore, even Jesus taught that there are things in this fallen world as a result of the sin that we have to deal with. And you said there's nothing beautiful about cancer. There's something beautiful about a person who faces cancer, and in their spirit, in their inner person, they endure it. And with God's mercy and grace and strength, and with prayers, they overcome it. And they learn a lot about themselves through the experience, and they're a testimony. So, yes, it is ugly. It's not something we would seek. But there can be even beauty in going through a terrible difficulty like that. Or how about dealing with financial hardship? I have heard of one who at one time had a lot of wealth. And we've seen in this study of Ecclesiastes how Solomon, though he was the wealthiest that ever lived, he still had vexation and despair in his heart because wealth does not bring you true joy. And I've seen one who went through financial hardship. Just as I've seen one go through cancer, I've seen somebody go through financial hardship, and I've seen them dig deep, and I've seen that God has taught them what's the most important thing in their life, and that we should not make money a god. And a lesson is learned, and great faith is taught and relied upon. I could even talk about stories of COVID, one of which is the very thing I'm doing now. COVID was an awful thing. In fact, many places shut down, including churches. But in a beautiful way, God allowed there to be new technology, as even I'm using today, and even as I've continued today, to do something that I did not do before COVID, which was to record these messages. These are just such limited examples. Look back at your life and think of something that you at one point thought was so bad, but God had something beautiful come out of it. Continuing on, I feel like every study in Ecclesiastes I rush through so much. Here's a really deep thought. God has made us, of all creation, unique in His image. We're made in His image. And it says He's put eternity into man's heart. Think about even being able to comprehend that. God has also made the animal kingdom, but the animals can't contemplate eternity in their heart. He's made us unique. And we can understand, even though it's so difficult, at least in a limited way, we understand that there is a concept of eternity and there are things beyond this earth. Yet, what God has done from the beginning and to the end, there are things that only God knows. And I believe, as Paul said, that right now we're just seeing a dim image that we only know in part, but we will understand fully, and that day will come. We have a glimpse of eternity. We'll have a deeper understanding of eternity. But beyond these deep thoughts, there's also a simple thought, even though it's hard to execute. He says, there's nothing better for us to be joyful and to do good as long as we live. We should eat and drink and take pleasure in our toil. This is God's gift to man. Think of that simple precept. Be joyful. We talked about with the other time and seasons about the immutability of God, but the things in which we have a choice. This is a choice to be joyful. Think of the beautiful letter that Paul wrote to the church at Philippi in Philippians. He said, rejoice, and again I say, rejoice, be joyful. It's our choice to have a heart of joy. It's contagious to have joy instead of despair and to do good. And we can't save ourselves. We're saved by God's grace, but certainly, as much as lies within us, let us be joyful and let us do good. And taking pleasure, we're also told in the New Testament that if we have food and clothing, let us therefore be content. Be content with what we have instead of always envious or striving after that which we don't have. To be content with what we do have, to be joyful with the time that we have, to be joyful with the gifts that we've been given, and to do good as long as we live. A deep thought, a simple thought in that same passage. I'm going to end on this one. A lot going on today. But I really like this concluding part of this stanza here. So Solomon here, he's little by little unveiling new layers of who God is in this letter, in this book of Ecclesiastes. He said, so I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. That's God's time. Look at how this contrasts with the opposite of vanity. Vanity's a vapor. Vanity doesn't last. What God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it. God's time is complete. God's work is complete. What He does lasts forever. What He does is complete. And it can't be robbed or taken away. It is secure because He's done it. So we should acknowledge Him and fear Him in reverence. He's also our loving Father, but we should have a fearful reverence of who He is. That which is has already been. That which is to be already has been. God seeks what's been driven away. God knows your time. It's in his hands. He knows your circumstances. It's in his hands. Can I encourage you with some thoughts today in conclusion? Be secure in who God is. That he made you and he endures forever. That he's doing a work in you. That he's given you this time to receive it with joy, to be secure in it. To use the time that you've been given. All of eternity's in God's hands, but he's put something in our hands. There's God's time and our time. God holds all time, but he's given us a limited time. Let us be joyful. Let us do good. Let us be busy with the work in which he's given us. I hope you can reflect upon God. I also hope you can practically apply this to your life and know that whatever it is, that God will make all things beautiful in its time as well.